They are asking for any video or eyewitnesses who may have seen the Frattolins from July 11th up to July 19th.
When 9-year-old Melina told her mother, "We'll be home soon," it was meant to be a reassurance. But something changed in those final hours. When authorities received the call about Melina's disappearance, the details didn't add up. The explanation given raised more questions than answers. If the official account wasn't true, what version of events would make sense? To piece together what really happened that day, we need to examine everything, from the carefully planned trip to the inconsistencies that emerged afterward. 9-year-old Melina Frattolin was eager for one more summer memory before heading back to class. A short, scenic road trip with her father, Luciano. It was supposed to be a relaxed and cheerful getaway, a chance to enjoy each other's company before life returned to its usual routine. Just a few quiet days together, the kind that later becomes a family favorite story. No one imagined it would become a chapter they'd never want to revisit. On July 11, 2025, the two set off, crossing the U.S. border from Canada and weaving their way through parts of New York and Connecticut. For the next 10 days, they stayed in modest hotels, wandered through wooded trails, and even navigated the busy streets of New York City. Their photos showed smiles, their itinerary was spontaneous, and everything looked like the kind of trip travel blogs promise but rarely deliver. Yet as their journey neared its end, something subtle shifted, less like a plot twist, more like a quiet, unwelcome rewrite. As the sun began to dip on Saturday, July 19th, around 5:30 p.m., witnesses noticed Luciano's Prius passing through Saratoga Springs. Not long after, Melina placed a call to her mother in Montreal. It was the kind of brief, ordinary check-in that happens at the end of a trip. She mentioned they were heading home. Her tone gave no reason for concern, no alarm bells, just another call. Sadly, it would be the last one her mother ever received. Later that evening, precisely at 10 p.m., emergency services were contacted by Luciano. His voice sounded urgent. According to him, they had pulled over along a quiet forested road near Lake George so he could step into the trees for a moment. When he returned, he said, Melina was no longer in the car. Authorities summarized his version succinctly. He had walked into the woods, and when he came back, his daughter had vanished. But before we begin, I just want to say thank you to my amazing viewers and subscribers. Your support through likes, shares, and comments means the world to me. Your engagement helps make these stories even more meaningful. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Then came the detail that shifted the case into high gear. He added that a white van had shown up. According to him, two strangers emerged, took Melina, and drove off. As stories go, it was certainly dramatic, just not necessarily convincing. That single account was enough to mobilize a massive search effort. An Amber Alert was issued almost immediately. Roadways were temporarily shut. Helicopters hovered over the forest canopy, and search dogs were dispatched into the area. The operation escalated quickly, but soon questions began to surface. No one had seen any unusual vehicles. No tire impressions were found. Dash cams offered nothing, and oddly enough, no driver on that road reported anything out of the ordinary. It was as if the van and the men had simply disappeared, or perhaps never appeared at all. The only person still on site was Luciano. He was alone, disoriented, visibly overwhelmed, and firmly holding to his story about the van. But without evidence to support it, the situation took a quieter, more unsettling turn. Investigators and Melina's mother were left facing a deeply uncomfortable possibility. If there was no van, then the explanation for what happened was going to be far more complicated and much closer to home. In just a matter of hours after the 911 call, the direction of the investigation began to quietly shift. While the public remained focused on reports of a suspicious white van, law enforcement had started looking at something very different. Doubts were growing around Luciano Frattolin's account, and although search crews were still active, their goal had changed. This was no longer a rescue effort. It was becoming a recovery mission. A key turning point came when surveillance footage surfaced from a gas station near Lake George. Luciano could be seen pulling in just hours before the emergency call, with Melina seated beside him in the car. She appeared calm and unharmed. But notably, that stop was never mentioned, not in his call to 911 and not during his initial interview. On top of that, data from his phone showed activity in an entirely different location than the one he had described. The mismatch between what he said and what the evidence showed was becoming harder to overlook.
That's when authorities issued a public request for assistance in tracing the path of the 2024 gray Toyota Prius, the same car Luciano and Melina had been using since July 11th. They were hoping that someone, somewhere, had captured a piece of the puzzle. Dash cam recordings, security camera snapshots, or even a casual observation. At this point, their focus had shifted entirely. They were no longer interested in confirming the story about the white van. They were working backward, trying to track Luciano's movements and determine exactly when things had taken a turn. Then a new account emerged that immediately caught investigators' attention. A local resident named Rebecca Kalui came forward after seeing news coverage and realizing something about that Saturday evening had stuck with her. She described passing through 𝐂𝐫𝐜𝐻𝐸 on her way towards Screw Lake when a gray Prius caught her eye. It wasn't doing anything dramatic, just pulled over in an odd spot, but it lingered in her mind, not for how it appeared at first, but for what happened just after. As I passed the car, I noticed a tall, thin man standing nearby, Rebecca recalled. Something about it just felt off. We made eye contact, and I remember thinking it was strange, though I couldn't quite explain why. She didn't see anyone else with him, but the moment stayed with her. The next day, when the Amber Alert appeared on her phone, it all seemed to click into place, and she was overcome with dread. "I can't even describe the feeling," she said later. "It just sank in." She wasted no time and contacted the authorities, filing 2 detailed reports about what she'd witnessed. Her information would quickly become one of the most crucial early tips in the case. While police worked to untangle Luciano's timeline, Melina's mother was spiraling into quiet distress. She had spent most of Saturday night reaching out, text after text, call after call, hoping for a response. She kept it simple, just wanting to know when he'd be home with their daughter. That was the plan after all. But with each passing hour and no reply, the unease settled deeper. Something felt undeniably wrong. She couldn't admit it aloud yet, but she could feel it in her bones. By Sunday morning, just under a day since Luciano had made the emergency call, that lingering sense of unease had shifted into something far more concrete. Using location data, conflicting details from his statements, and input from locals, authorities concentrated their efforts on a dense wooded area near Taikandera. The focus of the search had changed. No one was expecting good news anymore. They were preparing for confirmation of what they had already begun to suspect. At approximately 10:50 a.m., New York State Police forest rangers made a discovery in a shallow pond tucked inside the wooded terrain. Her remains were discovered in the shallow water beneath a fallen log, just about 30 meters from where she and her father had been staying. She was still wearing the same clothes from the previous day, the kind of outfit a child might happily choose with a parent's help, unaware of the sadness that would later surround it. What unsettled investigators most wasn't just the location where Melina was discovered, it was the condition she was in. There were no disruptions, no clear signs that anything had gone wrong. It seemed as though nothing had happened at all, and that's what made it so difficult to process. Whatever unfolded that day did so without warning, and likely from someone she felt completely at ease with. To Melina, Luciano wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone to be feared. He was her father, her comfort, her familiar face. And that's what made this story so deeply painful, because she had no reason to be afraid of him, and every reason to trust him. When the preliminary findings came in, they offered more insight into what had taken place. It was determined that Melina had lost her life due to complications from drowning. This wasn't described as a tragic mishap or the result of panic. The findings pointed toward intention, something that was done, not stumbled into. The official review left little room for doubt. This had been a deliberate act. With that understanding, authorities moved forward quickly. Luciano was arrested and formally charged, including for attempting to cover up the situation. Just days before, he had stood in front of cameras, appearing concerned and cooperative. Now he was being named as the primary person responsible. It's the kind of twist that would feel far-fetched in a film, but reality, as it often does, had written a script no one wanted to read.
Even as headlines circulated and Luciano's booking photo made its rounds, the disbelief lingered. Neighbors, strangers, even those who had never met Melina, gathered quietly to honor her memory. A candlelight vigil was held, simple, solemn, and full of unanswered questions that hung in the air like smoke. One attendee put it into perspective. When something like this happens, you imagine it through your own eyes. It could be your child, your niece, your student. And when the person involved is someone who's meant to care for them, it leaves a hole no explanation can fill. But this wasn't only about mourning one child. The community stood together because of what her story represented, a shared sense of vulnerability. Even those who never knew her felt the weight of it. The one question everyone whispered, though no one dared to speak too loudly, was the same. What would make a parent betray their own child in such a deliberate and calculated way? Unfortunately, this story didn't end there. Because when investigators began piecing together more of Luciano's history, what surfaced wasn't just motive, it was a long simmering issue that, in hindsight, looked less like a mystery. A casual glance at Luciano Frattolin's Instagram in the weeks leading up to Melina's passing might have painted a very different picture. There were coordinated outfits, playful selfies, and heartfelt captions. In one post, he referred to her as his reason for everything. On another, he called her the light that keeps me going. Valentine's Day featured a sweet moment beside a horse, and her birthday brought a photo of the two locked in a warm embrace. From the outside, it all looked picture perfect, like the dad everyone else wished they could be. And now, those same photos carry a weight they were never meant to hold. To anyone scrolling through his feed, Luciano came across as the kind of father who cherished every moment. But as is often the case with social media, the captions said one thing, reality said another. Beneath the surface of carefully curated snapshots, something far more complicated had been taking shape. Luciano Fred Holland was born in Ethiopia to a multicultural family, his mother Ethiopian, his father Italian. Much of his adult life was spent abroad, where he built a reputation as a savvy businessman with ties to major construction and mining deals. In 2019, he partnered with a Chinese-backed firm and secured a long-term contract on a mining venture. He had influence, resources, and according to those close to him, a personality that wasn't always easy to define. One former colleague told the Montreal Gazette that while Luciano clearly cared for Melina, he wasn't exactly built for everyday parenting. He had a soft spot for her, the friend recalled, but he never seemed too thrilled about the whole daily routine part of being a dad. Things took a noticeable turn in 2019. Reports from that time suggest Luciano experienced a serious incident in Ethiopia that affected his vision permanently. Friends later recalled that this event marked a major change in his overall demeanor. Not long after, Melina's mother traveled overseas to support him, but what she reportedly walked into was a relationship-ending moment. Upon arrival, she discovered him with someone else. That was the breaking point. She left, returning to Canada with their daughter and closing that chapter for good. From there, Luciano's connection with Melina became distant, both literally and emotionally. Sources say he rarely made visits, maybe once a year. Meanwhile, Melina remained in Montreal under her mother's care, attending school and living a steady routine, while Luciano divided his time between continents. His focus seemed to be on his ventures and less on his responsibilities back home. There were even mentions of financial obligations that quietly went unmet. And that Instagram image of a hands-on, present father, it turns out it may have been more curated than candid. Behind the glowing posts, Luciano was said to be facing serious financial pressure and growing frustrations. According to a now-deleted profile for his former coffee company, he openly mentioned struggling with the everyday chaos that came with parenting. A scattered craft table, a few toys out of place, the usual creative messes that most parents learn to step over. But for someone used to control and structure, these small signs of a child's world seemed to push his patience thin. The irony? The man who once called her his inspiration couldn't quite handle the day-to-day that came with raising her. What makes the situation even more complicated is that Luciano wasn't just putting on a show for his daughter. He seemed to be performing for everyone. From designer outfits to flashy cars and scenic trips, it all looked polished. But behind the filtered images and luxury snapshots, the truth was far less glamorous. Things were falling apart.
Financial strain had reportedly followed Luciano for years. One longtime acquaintance shared that he often found himself in serious financial binds, forcing him to leave Ethiopia for long stretches. Whenever the pressure got too close, and the friend said, he'd vanish, usually to Italy, and then pop back up later like nothing had happened. His social media, which has since gone private, told a different story, one of jet-set living, high-end labels, and zero-budget flights. It looked effortless, but most of it was borrowed time and borrowed credit. Back in Canada, he had been renting a stylish apartment in Montreal's Mile End district since 2020, using it as an Airbnb listing. He didn't run the day-to-day himself. He had two managers handling the operations and payments, but by 2024, the arrangement had completely unraveled. Court filings show a tangle of disputes between Luciano and his partners. He alleged they had mishandled money, taken over the listings, and redirected income without his consent. And if that wasn't enough, things came to a head that August. He was evicted from the property after falling more than $26,000 behind on rent. According to Le Devoir, not only was he legally removed, but he was also permanently banned from returning, even though he claimed his daughter's things were still inside. Life in the spotlight had officially left the stage. So what was Luciano's next move? He filed yet another legal complaint. This time, he sought over $115,000 from the individuals who had managed his rental property, claiming they had caused major damage to both his brand and his income. In response, those same individuals alleged that Luciano had plans to empty his accounts and quietly leave the country, raising even more questions about what was really going on behind the scenes. Then there were the cafes. Luciano had once positioned himself as the entrepreneurial force behind Depon Cafe and Gambella Coffee, two businesses he used to highlight his heritage. But court filings revealed a different picture, one where he owed over $83,000 to a major bank for one cafe alone and had nearly $97,000 more in outstanding credit card balances tied to business expenses. To sum it all up, by the time he saw Melina for what would be her final visit, Luciano was facing eviction fallout, multiple ongoing lawsuits, substantial debt, and allegations from former partners. There were even reports that he was no longer allowed to return to his former residence. Despite all that, he continued presenting an image of success, a world-traveling, confident father whose life appeared perfectly under control, but behind that display was someone struggling to hold it all together. Melina, in many ways, may have been his last remaining connection to stability, his one link to a version of life he couldn't seem to recreate. And that leads to one of the most difficult possibilities to consider. What if, to Luciano, Melina represented more than family? What if, in his unraveling world, she became the last thread he could still grip, the one person who made the illusion seem real, even if just for a moment? Just a few hours before everything changed, Melina had called her mother. It was a short conversation. She said they'd be heading back soon. There was no hint of distress, no sign that anything was wrong, and then nothing. That would be the last time her voice was heard. Investigators believe the timeline between the call and the emergency response later that day holds the answers to what happened next. Between the phone call and Luciano's 911 report, something irreversible occurred. Authorities believe that during this window, Melina's life came to a quiet end, far from home. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that there were no warning signs. No one thought this visit would be anything but routine. Melina's mother didn't think twice, said one source close to the family. She felt safe knowing her daughter was with her father. There was no reason to worry. So what exactly happened? Was this a sudden emotional collapse, or had something been building behind the scenes for much longer? When you look at everything Luciano had been facing, financial chaos, legal pressure, and increasing instability, it starts to look less like a single breaking point and more like a slow-motion crash. On July 21st, Luciano appeared in court for the first time. He entered a plea of not guilty to a serious charge, one that carries a potential lifetime penalty. He also informed the judge that he couldn't afford legal representation, which, considering everything else, wasn't exactly surprising. Outside, the press gathered. He was escorted by officers, said nothing, and kept his gaze fixed ahead. It was a moment heavy with silence and questions. If this was truly a sudden emotional break, why were there so many signs beforehand? How long had the pressure been building, and why didn't anyone see it? As someone who spends time exploring these stories, this one lingers. Not because it's the most shocking, but because it might have been preventable. It's a reminder that behind perfect photos, real struggles often hide, and silence can speak volumes. If this story resonated with you, consider liking and subscribing. It helps keep these stories alive and ensures they're not forgotten.